Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Margaret Kimberley joins us today, and we talk about Margaret's new book titled Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. And we also talk about the current Black Lives Matter protest movement. Here's Dr. Cornell West's comment about the book. Quote, Margaret Kimberley gives us an intellectual gem or prophetic fire about all U.S. presidents and their deep roots in the vicious legacy of white supremacy and predatory capitalism. Such truths seem more than most Americans can bear, though we ignore her words at our own peril, unquote. There's also an extra bonus question for patrons, episode 172 Extra, where we get Margaret's advice for people who strongly support anti-racism, strongly oppose police brutality, discrimination, and the militarization of the police, but who prefer peaceful protests and are uncomfortable with random violence and the political exploitation of these issues by disingenuous politicians and others who are actually part of the problem themselves. Margaret Kimberley is an author. She's also the co-founder and editor and senior columnist for the Black Agenda Report. Her Freedom Rider column appears weekly in Black Agenda Report, and it's widely reprinted elsewhere. She's from New York City. Her work has appeared in numerous publications and websites, and she writes at her own blog, Freedom Rider. We recorded this on June 20th, 2020. Margaret Kimberley's here. She's back on the show talking to us from New York. Hello, Margaret. It's great to talk to you, and thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Oh, thanks so much. I love coming on.
So, Margaret was on a book tour when the pandemic and the lockdowns started, and I was lucky enough to catch one of the smaller talks in Philadelphia, but then it just kind of derailed your whole promotion thing, and this is a great book. And first of all, I was wondering, are you going to be able to sort of resume your tour, or did you adjust to a different mode, or what's the story with that?
Yeah, my book Prejudential was published February 4th, and I got like 8 events in, maybe 9 events, and then in the middle of March, everything started to shut down. And so it did kind of derail the promotion. I've been doing my best. I've been I've been on podcasts like yours. I did a virtual promotion event last week. I'm online all the time, on social media all the time, trying to push the book. I have, and I hope it's still going to happen, an appearance in Boston. It's supposed to be July 17th, and I'm keeping track. Boston's supposed to be reopened by then, so I'm hoping that happens. So yeah, but I look at this on the bright side. It's, it could have been worse in February. It could have been March or April when it was published. So that's the way I look at it. I'm just very proud that I was able to get this done, and I'm doing as best I can to promote under the circumstances.
Yeah, I've seen a lot that you've done a lot of interviews, and it did get a lot of attention, so I was glad to see that. This is your first book, right?
Yes, it is, yeah.
And maybe just tell us a little bit about it at a summary level, and then we'll talk about some specifics.
Sure. So Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents is a study of all 45 presidents and their treatment of the Black population in this country. And it all began, I'm a columnist for Black Agenda Report, and it all started, I did a column about Theodore Roosevelt. There had been a public television documentary about him, and I knew enough about him to know that there had been a whitewash, no pun intended, of his racism and imperialism. And a friend and supporter of Black Agenda Report suggested to me, he said, write a book about all of them? And
Yeah.
I said yes, not knowing what I was getting myself into writing a book, although I'm very glad I did it. Sometimes I think it's important. You have to say yes when you're not really ready for something. Sometimes I think that that can be a good thing. And it took me longer than I thought, but I did it. And Cornell West was kind enough, generous enough to give me a blurb. That's very important in publishing, to have someone like him give you a blurb. But it's not like a scholarly work. It's about 200 pages. A friend of mine said it was. Did he say it was breezy? He said you can breeze through it, and it's good information. But so I kind of like that. So people have shorter attention spans now. So unless people are really serious about a topic, it's the way to go. But it was a learning experience for me. I would say half of the information I reveal were things I knew before I started researching, and half of the information was new to me. Uh, excuse me, some of it rather shocking. But
Yeah.
I think overall it's very important that Americans begin to talk about the truth as it is and acknowledge the degree to which we have been propagandized. And it's something, that's a word Americans aren't comfortable with in connection with their country. But when you look at the information, which and I as I did my research, I realized the degree to which many historians have lied on behalf of these people, and most of them are system affirming people. And I did not have access to secret archives. I mean, most of this information, if you start researching, it jumps out at you. It's not hard to find. But we live in a system that it has a lot of structures that are meant to keep us all in a state, frankly, of ignorance. And so that means historians, it means universities, it means textbooks, the media, politicians, all work to keep us uninformed. So I think it's, people call it revisionist history. I don't like the term. It's just history. It just is what it is. But I think it's very important to pursue this information as much as possible.
Right. And I would like to say that it is an easy read in terms it's not easy to read the material. It is there are a lot of shocking things in there, but the way you wrote it, most nonfiction books, maybe not most, but a lot of nonfiction books are really dense. um they're fascinating reading, but it's a very slow reading. And yours, there are two things that helped me. One, it was plain spoken. It was in digestible essays. Each one is like a digestible, each chapter is like a digestible essay. Points out the relevant things. There's no fluff. It's all, it's all just facts. And um, the other thing I was really happy about was that the Audible book is you reading. And I
Yes.
really,
Hmm.
really like that. I really like when the author does the uh, does the reading, because I don't know, it just means a lot more when the person speaking it is the person who wrote it. And so I was really glad that you did that. And so I read some of it and I listened to some of it. That way also I could do it more continuously too. Like if I couldn't
Uh-huh.
sit down and read, I could listen in the car, or I could
Yeah.
more continuously go through it. So I just was really happy about that. And you're a great reader and have a great voice too.
Thank
So
you.
that helps. So but anyway, anybody who like shies away from nonfiction books, this is not your typical nonfiction book. It's interesting, it's easy to read and listen if that's your preference. Um, so I would urge people to go for it. Um,
Thanks.
Now, there are lots of reasons why your book is well timed. And one that struck me while you were talking was the things that were not told or that were brushed over or whitewashed. And we see right now, we see like, people pulling down statues, and some of them are obvious, some of them are not. But when you read through this, you'll understand how some of these things, you might think like there was no good reason to rail against people in history, but there is, um, and they may be things that you weren't aware of. Uh, Also, Margaret,
Hmm.
I notice as I'm getting older, in real time, I'm watching, and as like the media and the propaganda apparatus, which just seems to be better funded and bigger all the time, the way things are written about in real time, there's a lot of lies,
Yes.
big lies, small lies of every sort, and they're getting laid down, and somebody is going to go back and read these and consider it accurate history, and it is not at all. It's scary, and it makes me wonder if if this has happened in the past, or if it's always been this way. And I'm starting to question pretty much all the history that I read.
Good.
Not,
Good for you.
not just historians who, you always have historians who they have their point of view, and you expect that there's going to be a slant, based on that person's biases and their positions and whatever. But just the widespread way things are written the by people with an agenda, and even people without, makes me go back and question how everything else was written. We always, we know that like history's written by the victor
Hmm.
in war history, so you're already prepared for that. And so you try to dig into other things like source materials, like letters and reports and documents and things like that. You don't just go by the way someone told the war story. But I had not considered it. I mean, not to the extent that I'm seeing now.
Oh, sure. It's a funny thing about the statues and the monuments. There's a lot of um, and I think it's important for people to be exposed to new information so they can free themselves. And one of the problems with all the lies is that people think they're well informed. So if you read the New York Times and you listen to NPR and you watch MSNBC, that you know what's happening in the world, when in fact you do not. So we have a lot of people who do what they think they need to do to be informed, and they still are not. And it's important for somebody to point that out. We saw, speaking of the New York Times, a couple weeks ago, the opinion page editor had to step down because Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, a very right-wing Republican, had written an op-ed. This is after the protests began, after George Floyd's killing. And Trump said the military should go into cities and quell these protests. And Cotton agreed with him. Well, there was an uproar, fortunately, among New York Times staff people. And it turned out that this gentleman, Bennett, as James Bennett, I believe his name was, he had pitched the op-ed to Cotton and not the other way around.
Right.
So this tells us that there's certain information that will never be seen in the New York Times. It means when they tell you that President Maduro of Venezuela is a tyrant, or Assad in Syria is a tyrant, you must question what they tell you. About when they say Putin is, stealing the election, all of those things are in question. And if unless you know who to follow in independent media, it's difficult to find out. And unless you read what is labeled as revisionist history, you don't know that they built a new capital city between Maryland and Virginia to make sure it was physically located among the states that depended on the chattel slavery system in order to give it physical protection. And I was a history major, And I knew they built a new capital, but nobody told me why. I mean,
Oh,
when you think about it, it's like, first of all, why do you need to build a new city? There were cities. But then you see that New York was the first capital. Washington was inaugurated here. Then they moved it to Philadelphia, which presented a problem for Washington, who was a slaveholder, because Pennsylvania allowed any enslaved person who was in the state for more than 6 months to be freed. And this presented a problem for Washington. So he, in a violation of a law to fight this loophole, he just rotated the people he owned and made sure none of them were in Philadelphia for 6 months.
yeah, that's amazing.
And but these are things that everybody should know. But and I'm at risk of repeating what I said. It's clear that the process of lying is acceptable by the elites. And they lie about so many things. And I think that's one of the reasons this protest has some staying power. People are angry about a lot of things. You can fool, I guess, was it Lincoln who said this? I don't know if it really was Lincoln. You can fool some of the people some of the time, but not all the people all the time. And the ones who don't want to be fooled are saying so. Although I'm not a Lincoln fan, I guess we can get to that too. But yes, there are lies about what's happening now in the country, lies about the past. And we have been told to respect people who were horrible. It is a good thing that people want to take down statues of Christopher Columbus. For people to find out that Winston Churchill caused a famine in India that killed several million people. We need for people finally to be told about King Leopold of Belgium and the genocide in the Congo. So that the only European genocidaire that people don't think of is Adolf Hitler. He wasn't alone. And why do you hear about Hitler but not Leopold?
Yeah.
Because one killed Europeans and one killed Africans. That's the truth of the matter. So, but I think it's good to always have that question about what we are being told. I think having that healthy skepticism, even if you don't have all the information yourself, I think that's something that's very important.
Yeah, and you did include some context in some places where I don't know, sort of like the legal matters that they were dealing with, or the wife really owned the slaves, or
Mm-hmm.
things like that, where some of the complexities of it, because there were in those early days, and I'm just going to introduce, I'm not the expert here, obviously. I'm not trying, I'm just trying to frame a question, not trying to make a statement, but there were people fighting slavery all along.
Mm-hmm.
And in my mind, like the abolitionists and the different people along the way who were trying to right the wrongs, or were trying to maybe just find a more palatable solution, they weren't always as noble as they are painted to be either. Because we have this we hold up a number of people who eradicated slavery or fought against it and things like that, and we see them, or we've been taught to see them as righteous and noble people. But like, that wasn't always the case. And maybe there are some examples that jump out you could cite, to because there are a number of them in the book.
Yeah, the support for slavery was very widespread. Of the first 12 presidents, 10 were slaveholders. And two of them, the Adamses, John Adams and John Quincy Adams, were those two from Massachusetts. They were Northerners. But John Adams, who was the second president, he was not really opposed to slavery. So we're told that he was, but that just is not true. At one point, he bragged that he never held a slave, and I have to mention here, slavery was legal in the North longer than people realize. But he defended the South. He defended they were called the slaveocracy or the slave power. He defended them. He feared Black people. He feared the presence of freed Black people. And he was one of those who advocated what was called colonization, sending Black people out of the country. And he said things that were, while he was not saying slavery was good, he defended the slaveholders. He said Southern whites were more oppressed than the Negroes are. Um, and so it was pretty loathsome, the things that he said. Uh, and that is an example of someone who gets this undeserved credit. Lincoln. Lincoln is thought of as the great emancipator, but he was another one who, until the end of his life, he wanted to send Black people out of the country. And that is directly contradicts everything I have been told. Usually they will tell you that he said that early in his career, but then he changed his mind. He stopped saying it. No, he said it until the end. And the Emancipation Proclamation, the day before he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he also signed an order creating a colony in Haiti, an island off the coast of Haiti, where they established a colony. It didn't last very long. They sent 400 people out of the country, and this was his what he hoped would be the beginning. And we know that Liberia, the African nation of Liberia, the capital city is Monrovia, named after President Monroe. But it's not a good thing. They established that country to get Black people out of this country. So these are some of the examples of people we have not been, where there's an attempt to whitewash them as well, where there's, there could be something positive to say about them, but it's only positive if you leave out everything else that is true. So those are just a few of the examples of people who have been held up as being more enlightened or more benevolent, and but when you look at the evidence, you see that it's just not true.
Yeah, and I mean, you can still give them some credit for being more enlightened and benevolent, but it's the lionizing and the, like, elevating them to almost like a sainthood, that's the wrong thing. You and it
Yeah,
doesn't give you a clear picture of what all the other things that were going on, and there were other forces they were trying to keep the country, they didn't want the country to break up, whatever. They're politicians, so they're making deals and this
mm-hmm.
and that, and compromises, and but
But
these are people's lives, and it's just a whole different thing when it comes to slavery. It's
right. Well, but the compromise was always in favor of the slaveocracy from the beginning. The 3/5 of a person, so they could get more representation, despite saying that enslaved people were not citizens. Um, all of the building a capital in the South. So there was always the Fugitive Slave Acts. All of these things were compromises that went in one direction. But there were always people who opposed it. And one of the things I have said to people is, and it's difficult when you've been told something your entire life, for someone to give you information, even if you accept that it's true. It's hard to turn off all that thinking that
yeah,
everything you've been subjected to. So I understand that people want to feel positive about their country. They want to feel positive about certain people. They want to think that, well, this president was a rogue, but this guy was a hero. I get that. But I say you need different heroes, and they shouldn't be presidents. So I have said half jokingly, if there's a white man from the 1800s who you want to lionize, it should be John Brown, because he was trying to start a slave insurrection. And while that particular plan failed, he succeeded in starting the Civil War a year and a half later. And that's a good thing, because slavery would not have ended without the military defeat of the Confederacy. So if we were given information about more people, you would still have, there are always people that you can see as heroic. You have to know they existed. You have to know what they did. Um, all of these people who have, as you say, have been elevated to this quasi sainthood, the presidents, all of them have. And we have a day dedicated to them, President's Day. I mean, how many cities and towns and schools are named after presidents? So slaveholders like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, there's still universities named after them. Christopher Columbus, the word Columbia came to mean this hemisphere. So, so we have the name Washington District of Columbia. So we've got the names of one slaveholder and one man who started the whole horrible process, the European invasions of this this hemisphere, and genocide and near, in some cases, elimination of some Indian tribes, chattel slavery, which was throughout North America, Caribbean, South America. And those are the names we're stuck with. The state of Washington, Columbus, Ohio, Columbia. The Indians are categorized as pre and post Columbian. The genocidaire gets to be the one who defines them. And it's hard to shake off, because this all normalizes behavior that, if we were talking about another group of people, it would be clear that these were really crimes against humanity by any measure, by any definition. But this normalization makes it hard to see that, and it makes it hard for people to want to see it also. Nobody wants to be the outlier. Nobody wants to think, and people have said to me, well, is there anybody I can like? Is there any president I can like? And and my answer is, you can feel whatever you feel, but it should be based on what's true. And I'm not going to tell people not to admire someone. As I said before, find somebody else to admire, because they're people who did good things. The people who helped the enslaved escape should be your heroes. The people who were called the radical abolitionists, who just wanted slavery to end, they can be your heroes. The people who spoke up against genocide, Native American genocide, can be your heroes. The people who spoke up usually against the people you're told to admire, in general, those should be your hero. Great artists can be your heroes. So I understand that, but find somebody else. That's my answer.
Yeah, yeah. And, just the whole process of making someone a hero instead of looking at, the whole picture and realizing that every human is a flawed human being, right? So maybe
Yes.
you could start there, and just the whole process of elevating people. I'm just starting to question that too.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That's. I mean, that's a good. It's a good practice to follow, because if we're talking about people's personal lives, I am one to um, you know, give to give a little, and find out somebody I admired, cheated on his wife or something, I'm, more likely to do that. But if we're talking about what people who had the power over the lives of others, what they did and why, I think we can question what they did as well. And you can say that someone did this that was good and this that was bad. You can do that too. No one has to be 100% one thing or the other. But it's important to acknowledge all of it. And I think people need to get used to it. It's one of the things I point out in the book. When Trump was first elected and the issue of monuments came up, and there were I'll just call it a riot. Somebody was killed in Charlottesville, Virginia, which began with the alt-right
yeah,
paying homage to, I think it was Robert E. Lee's statue. And Trump said, he said, well, what do you, and he actually asked a good question. He said, well, Jefferson and Washington were slaveholders. What are you going to do? Are you going to take down their statues? And the New York Times polled their readers, and only 4% of them wanted to take down their statues. And these are people who are not, Trumpites or people who wouldn't otherwise agree with something that he said. But it just shows you the depth of propagandizing that goes on in this country, that people who otherwise would not support anything they did would at the same time say, no, I don't want to take down a statue of Washington, but it's not hard to understand. The father of the country, everything named after him. Thomas Jefferson, he was brilliant. He spoke French. He had a library. He did this or did that, but he also owned a couple hundred people. He never freed any of them. He was a hypocrite. He would always say he thought slavery was bad, but he never got out of the business himself. So, the monuments in Washington, everything, all of it makes it hard for the truth to come out and for people to want to accept it. And I also think we can say that we're struggling with it. But I think that is an important step for people to acknowledge that. And yes, these statues need to come down, and they need to stop with these public television, documentaries telling you that so-and-so was brilliant. And yes, they may have been, but not tell you about the fact that they were in the slaveholding business.
Yeah, I mean that's really the key point is the whitewashing, as you put
Mm-hmm.
it in the beginning. And it also you did a good job of pointing out the opportunities that they had to free their own slaves
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. But the what I didn't know was like the wides there was fear, right? They basically feared retaliation for so it wasn't just racism, but they were worried about what was going to happen
Well,
when they
I think the fear was racist, though. I think they had done so much wrong. They just assumed that if given a chance, Black people would take revenge against them. So, so Adams, would go on and on about how dangerous freed Black people were. All of them who advocated colonization, they all knew. I mean, it was a recognition of the great wrong they had done,
yeah.
and so they knew they had been terrible and feared that there would be a terrible response towards them. And ultimately, they wanted a whites only country. That was the whole point of the settler colonial project, was to take this place, to take it over. And Lincoln said so more than once. He wanted it to be a whites only country. And so whatever fears or questions they had about the presence of freed Black people, that was at the root of it. And that's what we're still dealing with now. And I think the recognition of these people and what they did will free us. I think it'll be something that's hard to do. I mean, we've already seen the reaction. I wrote about it this week in Black Agenda Report. There was a group of you can only call them thugs. They were white supremacists who came out with guns and baseball bats to defend the Columbus statue in Philadelphia. Um, they don't want to hear it because our governor here in New York, Governor Cuomo, said, well, Columbus is a heroic figure to Italian Americans, and he's a symbol of our achievement in this country. And what he didn't say is that Columbus makes Italian Americans, it puts them in the settler colonial narrative too. They were not the Southern European Catholic immigrants who were looked down upon when they first arrived. Columbus helps make them white Americans, and they can be pilgrims of a kind. So we have to understand that, but we've got to start changing it. And so that's a problem for Andrew Cuomo, in my opinion. It's not a reason for anybody else to change what they do. But there's going to be a reaction to, and we have to know that, but that can't stop us either.
Ah, I didn't know he said that. That's
Yeah, he
interesting.
did.
And I just want to be clear. I'm not saying that they were justified in their. I'm just. It's something that it's a theme that has been running through a lot of the people, a lot of the things that I've been reading about and thinking about lately, with current um, atrocities, if you will, and current oppression and things like that. Um, that it's not just the racism. There are some people who maybe they realize, in their hearts, or whatever heart they have, that what they're doing is wrong, but they now fear retaliation because of their own mindset, because of the things they have done and the kind of, I don't know, the kind of tactics they've used. They think, well, I would like to, like, for instance, I'd like to give the Palestinians their rights, but if we do, they're going to become the majority and they're going to kill us, that kind
Mm-hmm.
of thing, because we killed them, because of what we did to them. And it becomes this thing that can't be broken. Like, I often wonder some of the leaders and the people and the horrible things they've done, and I try to figure what kind of mindset could do that, what kind of person could do that. And I think that there's that fear of retaliation that
Mm-hmm.
overcomes any benevolence in trying to
Well,
set things right.
mm-hmm. But I think those fears, I mean, you can use it for, that's why people oppose affirmative action. Um, uh, if, could be called quotas or set asides or whatever terms were used to try to repair. We talk about reparations payments, but that's a kind of reparation, in my opinion. Um, I think there's a recognition that the system prefers one group over another. So people, even people who they may not be racist, but they know that if your parents can pick up the phone and call their friend and get you a good job right out of college, if you change that at all, and if other people got the equality of access that you have, that one has as a result of being white, they know that threatens them. So I think there's a recognition of some unfairness, even by people who say they don't practice it, or people who gentrify. I live in Harlem, and the numbers of white people moving here in recent years just continues to increase. And I think it's funny. People have a Black Lives Matter sign, and I guess that's nice, but your presence here is displacing other people and has caused a disruption to their lives, and it's had a negative impact. So I think, though, and I know that's hard. It's hard to give up something. Who wants to give up something? If you know that your friend or your relative can get you a job, or you have more money than people than the original inhabitants of a neighborhood, so now you can move in and better your life, you know that it harms them in some way. Um, but I think people have to. I think people have to be pushed, though, because good intent. Somebody may feel guilty about being a gentrifier, but if they still move in, they're still a gentrifier. Whatever their, regardless of any misgivings that they may have had about it. So I think there has to be a pushing of people to recognize the role they the role they do play, and the role they can and perhaps should play, um, and just by virtue of being what they are, in this case, white people in this country, that they have certain advantages, or just knowing that as a white person, if you walk into a store and you have accidentally have a counterfeit bill, like $20 bill like George Floyd has, you're not going to die because of it.
Yeah.
And nobody's going to call the police on you because of it. So I think we can ask people to push themselves a little more. And if you know that you're not going to die if something like, or this poor man who just died in Atlanta, Rayshard Brooks, he was just a sleepy man. He fell asleep in his car at a fast food restaurant, and it escalates into him being shot and killed. Um, so if you know that that's not going to happen to you, then you should be the first one to agitate for change. And when people say we need community control of the police, you should say, yes, we do need that. And not hang on to what you know or what you've been used to, uh, or a system which you know either advantages you or won't hurt you. So I that's what I would like to see. I would like to see people just to push themselves a little bit. Nobody has, and inevitably at this point in the conversation, someone talks about feeling guilty and do you want me to feel guilty? No, that doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help you. Doesn't help anybody else. But I'm saying that people need to stop giving themselves advantages. Start realizing, well, I think some people all outwardly, they do know. They know that if their parent went to an Ivy League school, they have a better chance of getting in. And then that means you get a better job. And that gives you a leg up in so many ways. So people know that's why they do it. That's why people spend a fortune to send their kids to certain schools. They know that it gives them an advantage. So own it and ask yourself how you can change that or improve things for other people. So I hope that made sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean that the structural nature of it is a tough solution, a tough thing to solve. There, especially when someone's going to have to step back and if they think they're going to suffer for it, that's what makes this, even if you fully acknowledge the problem, getting to a solution is that's the thing that's going to require a lot of work. And I think that we're making some progress. I mean, I hope we're making some progress, but
I think so.
um, yeah. So I just wanted to also ask you about. There's one paragraph in. Sorry, I got to pull this book up here. Um, in LBJ's time,
Mm-hmm.
I thought that there may be some parallels for what's going on today. And you say Lyndon Johnson's racism was well known, but it's overlooked in the interest of creating a happy narrative. He's remembered as the president who shepherded the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act through Congress. When announcing the passage of the Civil Rights Act, he famously said, "We shall overcome." He's seen as a champion of the civil rights movement and is considered a president who was good for black people. But Johnson did only as much as he was forced to do by the demands of black America. The civil rights movement was a time of intense and dangerous struggle. The tendency to minimize the ordeal and the victory of black liberation must be rejected. The protest was most effective when unfettered by political party allegiance. The people who pushed the politicians, alongside conservatives in the civil rights establishment, created a very necessary crisis and thereby forced Johnson to do what he otherwise would not have. He was, after all, a man who casually wrote, and I'm not comfortable with the N word,
Sure.
but he used it, and about the person who drove for him.
Yes.
Um, and in a letter of permission he gave to his black driver.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, so people can read this for themselves, but I thought that's what we're seeing right now. There is in a different way, in a different time, but the police brutality, um, the use of force, the progressive militarization of the police, the so-called justice system, um, for people who are uncomfortable with this thing, Johnson would not have done these things unless he was pushed to do it. And then you also bring up the second big point here is that even then, uh, making it a partisan thing didn't help anybody. And efforts to create a third party were still squashed. But so I guess those are the two big points that jumped out at me with parallels to today was that nothing's going to happen without some shock to the system,
Yes.
and making it a partisan thing is not going to help. I think it's going to be true today too. It's really not going to help much. It's going to be problematic, and I think I botched that opening, but I'm going to turn it over to you, Margaret, and hope that you can recover it.
Sure, sure. I think uh, the presidents like Johnson who get credit for as being, as many people or mostly older people are wont to say, being good for Black people. They responded to a demand. The uh, it's funny. Someone once pointed out to me that most Black people lived in the South and could not vote, and but they are the ones who got to vote without being able to vote.
Wow.
And there is we forget what people do outside of the system that makes the system change. And this business of having an allegiance, in this case now to the Democratic Party, which was a switch, the Democrats were the party of the segregated South, but and this wishful thinking that we just have to put a certain person in office when we must have an adversarial relationship with politicians.
Right.
And this has gotten worse now with Trump being in office because he's supposed to be the most evil, the worst thing that could ever have happened. And I'm not a Trump admirer. I am on the left. I'm not even a Democrat. I'm a Green Party member. So I understand that reaction to him. But we are not going to be saved if Joe Biden is president, and he isn't. Biden is one of the senators who bragged about the crime bill of the 90s, which put so many Black people in jail. Um, and we see the Democratic Party, which is beholden to corporate interests. And what are they doing now in the face of these protests? They'll have some stupid pandering photo op and take a knee in Congress, but they are opposed to all the fundamental changes that need to happen in police departments across the country. So the being loyal to them is not the answer. It's being in opposition to them. That is what we need. And one of the things they did after the civil rights movement was to create this class, this Black political class, who function as window dressing. Frankly, they give the impression that there is some level of Black empowerment, that we have some representation, and when in fact they do as their patrons tell them to do. Some of them very happily. It's not like they're being dragged kicking and screaming. Um, and that's what we have to remember about this country. FDR, he was, as I just said, the Democrats were the party of the segregated South. So his excuse for not passing anti-lynching legislation was, I can't do it. I need the Southerners. If you don't stick with me, you get something even worse. The same things that we hear now.
The lesser of
But
two evil thing. Yeah.
yes, yes, but the little he did, it's because a man named A. Philip Randolph, a union leader, threatened a march on Washington. So FDR did a little bit of civil rights legislation, mostly around employment in defense industries. Um, Johnson did what he did because the people pushed him, and because the people were not beholden to him either. And that is something. Unfortunately, it's been a long time since that has happened, and Americans have forgotten that. People say they revere the civil rights movement, but what is it that you're really respecting? You should be respecting the fact that people acted on their own behalf and made demands whether and without regard to how that would impact a certain political party. After the civil rights movement, there were huge demonstrations. We have an EPA. It's been watered down over the years, and especially now by Trump, because millions of people took to the streets to protest to protect the environment. They took people out of office. They targeted people for defeat. So Richard Nixon, a Republican, created the EPA. And that is the spirit in which people should be acting now. And not thinking that these people who have either not done anything or acted against their interests, that the only way to get what you want is to curry favor with people who are committed to not giving you what you want. So we're seeing, for example, this year, for the second time in a row, the Democratic Party made sure that Bernie Sanders did not get the nomination. And I believe that was their first priority, was making sure Bernie wasn't the nominee.
I do too.
And I don't think they care that much if Trump wins, to be perfectly honest. I think they can live with Trump. And so their goal was to tell people there is no talk of any reform. He was no radical. He's just considered radical because politics has moved so far to the right. The minimum wage used to go up all the time. It went up at regular intervals. Now you have an $8 and some cent minimum wage, and that's what it's been for years. The fact that public college used to be so cheap, it was practically free. It's just doing what people used to have. But that's anathema. That's off the table. That's not on the agenda. And Mike Bloomberg, the billionaire former mayor of the city I live in, has taken over the Democratic Party, and he's telling them there will be no progressive policy initiatives. None. They're off the table. And that's what happens when people depend upon the electoral system. I'm not saying people shouldn't vote or shouldn't support one candidate over another, but that cannot be the central focus. It's the actions that we take as individuals.
Right. Yeah, and the savior, the presidential
Yes.
savior is, if
Yes.
there's any message that you should get from the things that you've written and that you've laid out, Margaret, like that's it. Being a hyper partisan, looking for someone who says they're gonna, or people say are gonna fix everything, even if in private they're like Joe Biden saying, "I'm not going to change anything."
Yes.
This is not, and it's perennial. It happens over and over again. So great. That was a great answer. Thank you for saving my botched intro there.
Oh, that's
And so it sort of leads into my bonus question for you, which is not really a question. It's really a plea for advice.
okay.
So I'm a white person. I think that I am anti-racist and I have been for all my adult life. I definitely loathe the police brutality, the militarization of the police. I fought against that for a long time. The overuse of force. I've seen it firsthand in a town that I lived in. I saw the discrimination against Black and brown people because I started noticing that every time the cops pulled someone over, it seemed like 80% of the time it was a person with brown skin. And I was like, hey, how can that be? Yeah, we live close to Camden, and I guess there are a lot of Black people who drive on this road, but not that many. Mm-hmm. And there's something wrong here. And it did turn out. I myself, I'm diverting here a little bit.
Sure.
But there was one officer. I'm not saying that was the whole problem, and if you remove him, it solves everything. But there was one officer who was a zealot and a racist, and those pullovers were mostly him. I got pulled over by him one time. It was a place where there was no shoulder to pull over, and so I went around the corner. So I didn't pull over immediately. I made the turn to a place where I knew I could pull over. And he started screaming at, this was a maniac. This guy was just a maniac. And then later I found, I read about the fact that he was the one who was pulling things over, and they had to remove him, and then they had to every single case that he worked on got thrown out. And yeah, so I've seen it a little bit firsthand. But anyway, so for people who overall want to change the way the so-called justice system treats Black and brown people, but who also, I mostly prefer, and I think there are a lot of people like me, mostly prefer peaceful protests for a number of reasons. And I don't know if I've just been indoctrinated that they overall are more successful. And we know that some people there's been a big fight over this online recently over someone saying this, citing some kind of statistic. But anyway, I'm uncomfortable with the kind of random violence and destruction that hits people who weren't part of the problem really, and sometimes people who are already struggling, maybe they work for years to get food stores in their neighborhood or just to fix things up or whatever, and then they get hit by this by the vandalism. Who I think there are probably some bad actors involved too, as there always are, infiltration and things like that. But so I'm also the political end of it. Uncomfortable with the way it's being exploited by the Democrats right now, which you just talked about a little bit, who have shown themselves to be disingenuous politicians and other leaders who, because when they're in power, they don't honestly address the root of the injustice. They don't make the kind of changes. They're corrupt, and they don't address the inequality really when they have all the power to do it. So to be clear, I'm not talking about every act of violence. I'm not talking about the attack on the police precinct, for example, and a few other things I've seen. In my mind, real change would not have been set in motion unless there had been, as I had mentioned before, a shock to the system, and people in power in fear. They don't do anything unless they're in fear for their own selves. And so you mentioned that happened in LBJ's time. But if you would, as a friend of the show, who's generously taken time to talk with me and this audience, and someone I trust, I'm asking for your advice on how to approach this. How do I help me get my mind in the right place? And you've done that throughout this interview too, in bits. And tell me, how can I use what little resources I have at this point in time to help further the cause? And don't be afraid of offending me. I'm really asking for the straight talk because I trust you. The answer to the bonus question is in an extra bonus segment for patrons. So you can find that at patreon.com/aroundtheempire. There's also links at aroundtheempire.com. Episode 172 extra. I'm not great at marketing. Definitely not my forte, but I'm starting to provide more bonus material for patrons, as is necessary for independent media like this, funded solely by listeners. And that's because I appreciate them. They make it possible to pay the overhead costs of this show and compensate a little bit anyway for the labor that goes into it. So that's my tease. I hope some of you will subscribe to the podcast to get these kinds of extras. There are also full episodes for patrons only. This month there'll be a new Discord channel and hopefully some live streams for patrons only where we can discuss things among ourselves. And now I'll continue with the interview wrap up. And again, thank you, Margaret, for all you do. And thank you for the time that you've given. And it was just really great talking to you again.
Oh, thank you very much. I love coming on. It's always fun for me. I love the exchange. I love hearing from other people. So it's not a problem for me at all. I always look forward to it. Thanks.
All right. Take care then.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Margaret Kimberley. Follow Margaret on Twitter at Freedom Ride Blog. Find her work at Black Agenda Report and at her blog, Freedom Rider, and buy her book on Amazon, Prejudential. The Around the Empire podcast is independent media. Your support's really important. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. There are many ways to listen to the podcast, places to find it and listen. Find it on any mobile podcast app. on the website aroundtheempire.com, Patreon, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, please don't forget to share this and also like the video and subscribe. Follow on Twitter @aroundtheempire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.